Americans on the Western Front. General Douglas MacArthur commanded the Rainbow Division, which was composed of men from all 48 states and 3 U.S. territories. MacArthur would walk on top of the trench under machine gun fire just to inspire his men. In the German counteroffensive on March 21st, 1918, the German military began their last series of offensives in France and Belgium in an effort to finally win the war before the American Expeditionary Force arrived in Europe. French and British leaders urged the American leaders to send the AEF as soon as possible. U.S. forces, led by General John J. Blackjack Pershing, had not been wearied by the many years of war as the other Allied powers had. Their arrival helped boost morale and increase the number of Allied soldiers. By late May, the Germans were within 50 miles of Paris before being repelled by the American Expeditionary Force, using only 27,500 troops. Battles that involved the American Expeditionary Force. Rheims, the Second Battle of the Marne, July 1918. A second German attempt was repelled by 85,000 Americans. The German failure to break through or to destroy the Allied armies in the field allowed Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, to proceed with a planned major counteroffensive on July 18th. 24 French divisions, including the Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division and the 93rd Infantry Division under French command, joined by other Allied troops, including 8 large U.S. divisions under U.S. command, and 350 tanks, attacked the recently formed German salient. The Battle of Chateau Thierry was fought on July 18, 1918, and was one of the first actions of the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Blackjack Pershing. It was part of the Second Battle of the Marne. This assault on a 25-mile wide front was the first for over a year. The American Army played the larger role fighting for the regions around Soissons and Chateau Thierry. The Allied forces had managed to keep their plans a secret, and their attack at 4:45 took the Germans by surprise when the troops went over the top without a preparatory artillery bombardment, but instead followed closely behind a rolling barrage which began with great synchronized position. Eventually, the two opposing assault lines interpenetrated, and individual American units exercised initiative and continued fighting despite being nominally behind enemy lines. The Battle of the Argonne Forest. The massive Allied assault led to the most decisive victory in the war. On September 12th, Pershing won a swift victory at Saint-Mihiel and began moving his troops to the Argonne. Coordinated by Colonel George C. Marshall, this movement was completed in time to commence the Meuse-Argonne offensive on September 26. The Argonne, unlike the flat terrain of Saint-Mihiel, was a valley flanked by thick forest to one side and the Meuse River on the other. This terrain provided an excellent defensive position for 5 divisions under General the German armies, Jolt von der Merit's Fifth Army. Flushed with victory from Pershing's objectives on the first day of the attack, were extremely optimistic and called for his men to break through 2 major defensive lines dubbed the Gülster and Kriemhilde by the Germans. In addition, American forces were hampered by the fact that 5 of the 9 divisions slated for the attack had never seen combat. On attacking at 5:30 a.m. on September 26, after a prolonged bombardment by 2,700 guns, the final goal of the offensive was the capture of the Sedan, which would cripple the German rail network. The initial assault made solid gains and was supported by American and French tanks. Falling back, the Germans prepared to make a stand. In the center of the attack, bogged down, are troops of the Americans' Fifth Corps, struggled to take the 500-foot high Montfaucon. The next day, the advance proved slow, and American forces were plagued by leadership and logistic issues. By October 1st, the offensive had come to a screeching halt. Traveling among his forces, Pershing replaced several of his Green divisions with more experienced troops, although this movement only added to logistic and traffic difficulties. The Lost Battalion, October 2nd, 1918. Men of the 77th Division, 308th Battalion attacked the German lines under the belief that French forces were supporting their left flank, and two American units, including the 92nd Infantry Division, were supporting their right flank. The first of the 308th Infantry were led by Major Charles W. Whitsley and were making significant headway. Unknown to Whitley's unit, the unit to their left and right had been stalled. They now found themselves completely surrounded of 554 men by the German troops in the Argonne Forest. Without food, water, or reserve ammunition, cut off from supply and communication lines, and subject to constant assaults and bombardments, they managed to hold off the enemy until they were finally relieved. Roughly 197 were killed in action and approximately 150 missing or taken prisoner before the 194 remaining men were rescued. Most of the men, Irish, Italian, Polish, and Jewish, had grown up in the streets of New York as gang members, fighting from a young age for food. These attributes acquired on the streets are seen by many historians as one of the reasons that the group survived in the Argonne. Every runner dispatched by Whitley either became lost or ran into the German patrols. Carrier pigeons became the only method of communicating with headquarters. In an infamous incident on October 4th, inaccurate coordinates were delivered by one of the pigeons, and the unit was subject to friendly fire. The unit was saved by another pigeon, Cher Ami, delivering the following message: "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sakes, stop it." Despite this, they were able to hold their ground and caused enough of a distraction for other Allied units to break through the German lines, which forced the Germans to retreat. On October 8th, the 77th Relief Force had linked up with Whitley's men. Of the 500 soldiers who survived in the Argonne Forest, only 194 walked out unscathed. The rest killed, missing, captured, or wounded. For his actions, Major Charles White Whitley, Captain George G. Ramerty, and Captain Nelson M. Holderman received the Congressional Medal of Honor. The final assault. Austria-Hungary surrendered on October 8th and got out of the war. Between October 13th and 16th, American forces began to break through the German lines with the capture of Malbrook, Commes-Savoy, Côte-d'Armor, and Châtillon. With these victories in hand, American forces pierced the Cremieux line, achieving Pershing's goal for the first day. With this done, Liggett called a halt to reorganize. While collecting stragglers and resupplying, Liggett ordered an attack towards Grand Pré by the 78th Division. The town fell after a 10-day battle. On November 1st, following a massive bombardment, Liggett resumed a general advance all along the lines. Slamming into the tired Germans, the First Army made large gains with the Fifth Corps, gaining 5 miles in the center. In this forced a headlong retreat, the Germans were prevented from forming new lines by the rapid American advance. On November 5th, the 5th Division crossed the Meuse, frustrating German plans to use the river as a defensive line. Between November 6th and the 8th, on November 6th, the newly established German government asked for peace, but requested that peace negotiated be based on Wilson's 14 points. Some Allied leaders agreed that the 14 points could form the basis of peace negotiations. However, the British refused total freedom of the seas in an effort to preserve their own naval dominance, and the French demanded harsh reparations from Germany and Austria. The German government saw a revolution that led to the resignation of Kaiser Wilhelm II. German military leaders demanded that the civilian government request an armistice. The Germans contacted General Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, and agreed to the armistice if the Germans evacuated all captured territory and turned over a large amount of supplies such as freight cars and warplanes. On November 11th, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Great War ended, and it was all quiet on the Western Front. An American hero, Sergeant Alvin York. The World War I hero, who, when registering for the draft, said he did not want to fight because killing was, again, the book. Sergeant Alvin York was a pacifist who was raised in a poor family in Tennessee, registered for the draft, but did not want to fight in the war. He was the best shot in Tennessee, however, and the Army decided that he must fight in the war. While fighting the Meuse-Argonne offensive, York and his platoon were sent to take 3 dozen German machine guns on the ridge of the Argonne Forest in October 1918. After the guns killed or wounded every officer in the platoon and senior NCO, York became the leader of the 7 remaining privates who were trapped in no man's land with him. York ordered them to stay and secure the German prisoners they had earlier captured. He made his way up along to the German lines. When it was over, York had killed 28 Germans and captured 35 machine guns single-handedly. He and his much dwindled platoon captured a total of 132 Germans on their way back to safety. For his leadership and accomplishment, York was showered with Allied military honors, including the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor. When he returned to the United States in New York, he was given a ticker tape parade. Hollywood wanted to make him a movie star. York replied, "This uniform is not for sale." Casualties. In the picture, we see a Salvation Army worker writing a letter for home for a wounded soldier. U.S. overall, the United States suffered much fewer casualties than had the other fighting nations, especially due to the later entry of the United States into the war. During the 19 months in which the United States fought, however, 53,402 American servicemen died in combat, and 63,114 American military members died of diseases such as influenza. Around 200,000 Americans were wounded in the war. Although World War II would surpass World War I in the number of battle deaths 27 years later, it is interesting to note that more British, French, and Italians died in World War I than World War II. For context, the Germans suffered 1.6 million dead, the French 1.4 million dead, the British 658,000 dead, Russians 1.7 million dead. The war also devastated European economies and led to the political and social unrest. The United States, however, emerged as the world's dominant power during the 20s, in part due to its strength of the industrial economy during and after the war. The politics of peace. Wilson was the first president to lead the country for an extended period, which he did to attend the peace conference. While he was gone, he lost touch with the American people while being hailed as a victor for the Allies while in Europe. He alienated Republicans who helped him win the war by openly requesting that citizens vote only for Democrats in the 1918 congressional elections. Anything else, he said, would be a repudiation of his leadership. After Wilson injected partisan politics into the peace process, Democrats would lose 8 Senate seats, giving control to the Republicans, who also won control of the House for the first time in 100 years. Why is this important? Because it is the United States Senate who ratifies treaties, which was now under the control of the Republicans. The American peace delegation, fearful that the Republican criticism would undermine his peace program, Wilson took no senators or prominent Republicans to Paris with him, thus seeking, in reality, full credit for whatever treaty was fully negotiated. The Republican-controlled Senate had to ratify a post-war peace treaty. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Henry Cabot Lodge should have been taken, but the two men personally did not like each other. No U.S. president had ever gone to Europe or participated directly in the process which ended a war in which the U.S. was involved. His critics accused him of grandstanding and questioned if it was legal. His party included Secretary of State Robert Lansing, General of the Army Tasher Bliss, his personal secretary Colonel Howard House, and a career diplomat Henry White. When he arrived in Paris, Wilson found that many of his allies were not interested in the 14 points and had their own plans for rebuilding Europe and avoiding future wars on the same scale as the Great War. Georges Clemenceau, third to the left, France's premier, argued for reparations and wanted to punish Germany in its role for the war. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, second to the left in the photograph, agreed with France that Germany needed to be military and economically weakened to prevent future wars in Europe. Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, all the way to the far left in the photograph, wanted to gain territories from Austria. Wilson, to the far right in the photograph, insisted that his 14 points be followed. Germany and the other defeated powers were not invited to the Paris Peace Conference, and Communist Russia was also excluded. Allies' demands. Japan felt that they were not being treated as an equal and did not receive some of the mandates promised to them and left the conference. For Italy, at the Treaty of London in 1915, Italy was promised some strategic territory concessions for entering the war. An estimated 700,000 Italians had died in the Great War. Italy did gain Trieste in the former Austrian South Tyrol area, but was denied the port of Fiume and Dalmatia on the Asiatic coast, laying seeds for the belief that Italy was denied its just rewards. France demanded Germany pay reparations for the damage of the war that it caused. This would also keep Germany weak and unable economically to rise again. Germany was divided into new nations with areas that would serve to buffer states if they were to become aggressive again. The German delegation was appalled and not allowed to take part in the peace talks, but was finally presented with a finalized document and had to accept it or return back to war. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, very important. The treaty consisted of some 400 clauses. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, stated that Germany was sole responsible for the Great War. They'd have to admit guilt for the war and pay damages to civilian property for future military pensions and numerous indirect costs, which would end up being $56 billion. Germany further was stripped of colonies. German imperialism was attacked, but not imperialism in the general, because the Allies practiced imperialism and would not abandon it. Germany would not be permitted to rearm itself. It reduced Germany to a small military force. They could have no airplanes, submarines, and only an army of 100,000 men. The cornerstone of the 14 points was the League of Nations, a place where nations could settle their disputes by diplomacy, not war. Wilson had sacrificed everything, including agreeing to Article 231 to get his League of Nations. When the treaty approving the League was finished, Wilson returned to the defiant Senate, who refused to ratify it. So if we look at the three nations that are most angry at the Versailles Treaty, Japan, Italy, and Germany, they will become the Axis powers in World War II. And that's why historians say the Treaty of Versailles is the blueprint for World War II. Here is the Europe and Middle Eastern map after the Treaty of Versailles. Created out of the countries, or carved out, I should say, out of Russia and Germany, are the countries of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And as you can see in this region right here that is highlighted, this is going to give Poland access to the sea. Cut out of the Austria-Hungarian Empire are going to be new countries of Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Romania also gained territory as well. And in the Middle East, cut out of the Ottoman Empire, now called Turkey are going to be mandates of Syria, Iraq, Palestine, which we come under British rule. Ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. Opposition came from two camps: the irreconcilables, who were diehard isolationists, who opposed U.S. membership in any international organization, opposed participation in the League of Nations because they felt it would strengthen the power of imperialistic nations. There was also the group called the reservationists. These were a group of U.S. senators favoring approval of the Treaty of Versailles after it amended it to incorporate their reservations. They wanted a treaty with reservations, especially on Article 10, which involved the power of the League of Nations to make war without a vote by the U.S. Congress. This was mostly Republican, but also representatives of Irish and German Democrats. Wilson decided that he would apply pressure on the senators through their constituents, and he began a whistle-stop tour of the nation to drum up support. Eventually, he would suffer from a stroke, which left him paralyzed on his left side for the rest of his life. Wilson would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in 1920, but he died embittered in 1924. Finally, on October 18, 1921, the United States entered into a separate peace treaties with Austria, Hungary, and Germany. But Wilson was long out of office by then. Many scholars argued that the failure of the United States to ratify the Versailles Treaty and join the League of Nations ultimately led to a chain of events that allowed Nazism to grow in Germany and result in World War II. But this professor disagrees. The United States, especially its people, went back to strictly isolationist policies, and they would not support even the growing of German fascism, as other European countries failed to do so as well. It would take the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, would finally get the United States to enter World War II. The Spanish flu. Here we see office workers wearing gauze masks during the Spanish flu epidemic of January 1918. With the war over, society and industry had to revert to their pre-war levels of activity. But with the returning soldiers came a new problem, the so-called Spanish flu. Before the spring of 1918, 22 million died globally from this strain of influenza. Many public places closed in the United States in an effort to lessen the impact of the influenza pandemic. This became the most devastating recorded disease or war, famine, or natural disaster in such a short time in human history. Further devastation of an already war-weary world. Stumbling from war to peace. The 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, officially gave women suffrage the right to vote. In the 1920 presidential election, women made up 40% of those who voted. The majority would vote Republican for the first time due to Republican efforts to get the 19th Amendment passed. Released from wartime constraints, workers began to strike for their demands. The largest strike was the U.S. Steel Strike in 1919, which resulted in 340,000 workers walking off the job. Eventually, the workers won and returned to work. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge gained national attention when he ordered the National Guard to intervene in Boston after riots and loot broke out in 1919 when the police refused to return to work. Coolidge ordered that they all be fired and replaced, asserting that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time. Conflict at home. Race riots. Many African Americans who served in the Great War or contributed to the war effort had hoped that the war would improve their status or even lead to the full equality they had long sought. Instead of recognizing their contributions African Americans had made, many white Americans treated them with resentment, hostility, fear, and violence. As a result, the year 1919 was marked by race riots in the United States. Whites in Longview, Texas, invaded the black side of the town and to find a black man who was accused of allegedly dating a white woman. In Washington, D.C., was mobbed by whites and black gangs for 4 days till soldiers and rainstorm ended it. In Chicago, where around 50,000 African Americans had migrated during the war, tensions and competition for housing and jobs turned into 5 days of rioting in the late July 1919. The Red Scare. The fear that what had occurred in Russia could also occur in the United States promoted the first Red Scare. Wartime hysteria over everything German soon found another root in all things communist. After some radical militant anarchists in the United States mail bombed to around 40 prominent members of the government, fears of anarchism and communist revolution in the United States erupted into the so-called First Red Scare. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, after having his home targeted by an Italian anarchist, appointed J. Edgar Hoover to lead the newly formed General Intelligence Division within the Justice Department to collect information on radicals. Hoover's group worked closely with the rest of the Justice Department to try to root out radicals in the United States. In the November 7, 1919 Palmer raids, federal agents raided the houses of and arrested some 450 residents, aliens accused of radicalism, and deported them to Russia without a trial. Additional raids and arrests followed on January 2, 1920. They were claiming that they were well armed. Unfortunately, during the raids, they only produced one firearm. The effects of the Great War. The influenza pandemic and the economic, political, and social turbulence that had followed had a profound impact on a global scale. The Russian Revolution, for instance, resulted in the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922, with a strongly Marxist version of communism that helped shape the 20th century. The United States emerges as the world's most powerful nation, and its economy boomed overall.